In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this simple square pot holder, and it uses bias tape to finish all the edges. You can find the free printable pattern on gatheredseams.com, and I'll link to that in the description. In your main pattern piece, you'll need to cut a piece of fabric for the top, the bottom, and then a piece in cotton batting and a piece in thermal batting or heat resistant batting, so something like Insul Bright. And then for the pocket, you'll need 2 pieces for the outside and the lining, and then just 1 piece of your thermal batting. Because the pocket, you're not grabbing anything with it, it's just to protect the back of your hand from some heat. I only use the thermal batting. I don't add the other layer of cotton batting. You can if you want to, it just adds more layers, making it a bit more difficult to sew through. You'll also need bias tape that is 1/2 inch wide when it's double folded. And you're going to need a piece that's 8 inches long for there, and then 32 inches long to go all the way around. If you want to add a hang tab to your pot holder, then you can cut another piece that's about 6 inches long. You're also going to need a walking foot for your sewing machine. Anytime you're working with batting, it makes it much easier. And because there's so many layers of batting and fabric for this project, you definitely need to use a walking foot. The first step is to use a quilting stitch to stitch all of our layers of fabric together. So before I layer them, I just fold my design into my top layer of fabric. You can do whatever you like, a simple X. I'm going to do parallel lines. So to do that, I just finger press it into place. So now when I sew my quilting stitches, I'll just follow those creases. So you're going to start with your bottom piece, wrong side up, and then I do my thermal batting, and then my cotton batting, and then my top piece. The other thing you want to do when you're doing quilting stitches is to work in the same direction. If I sew my fabric, my one line this way, then flip my fabric and stitch back this way and continue on like that, then it's going to pull the fabric in different directions. So you always want to start at one end and stitch to the other end. Your batting will have shifted a little bit when you were doing these quilting stitches, so you can just take your pattern piece again and just lay it on top and trace around so you know exactly how much to trim off. Now we can put our pocket together, and if you like, you can do a similar quilting stitch to this. I just leave it plain. So you're going to layer it with the one piece with the wrong side facing up, and then your thermal batting, and then wrong side facing down. I stitch my bias tape to the right side, the outside of the pocket first, and I just open that up and make sure that the edge of my bias tape is just covering all of these layers of fabric and batting, and stitch from one end to the other in the fold of that bias tape. Now you flip your bias tape to the other side and just make sure that it's covering that line of stitching and clip it into place. I stitch from the top side, the right side, and just about 1/8 of an inch inside from that folded edge, and that'll make sure that you're catching the back of your bias tape. Before we sew our bias tape on, we're just going to tack our pocket into place so it doesn't move. And I don't like to use a basting stitch going all the way around, because I find no matter how many pins I use, it just seems to push the fabric, and then I end up with my pocket twisted. So I'll just line it up and clip it into place, and then also from the top on both sides down. If you want to add a hanging tab to your pot holder, you'll complete that step now. So you'll just take your 6-inch piece of bias tape and double fold it, press it, and then stitch on either side of that. Fold it in half lengthwise, meeting up the 2 raw ends, and then you'll just baste it on wherever you want, either at the top or the corner or the side. I just suggest sewing it on where you only have the 2 layers of batting rather than the 3, because it can be difficult to go through that many layers and then your bias tape as well. To finish off our pot holder, we're going to sew our bias tape on. I like to start on a flat edge here, and also where there's only the 2 layers of batting as opposed to here. It'll just make it a bit easier when it comes time to join the ends of our bias tape. So I start my bias tape about 2.5 to 3 inches. I'll start stitching there and leave this end loose. And then making sure again that the edge of my bias tape is just slightly covering the fabric of my pot holder. And then I'll stitch in the crease of that bias tape. And as you go around the edges, make sure you're not pulling on it, just gently guide it into place so that you're not sewing over any creases. You may need to pull a little bit, you just don't want to be aggressive with it. You'll also want to go slow. These are a bit more of a sharper curve, so it can take some time. I kind of sew a couple stitches, then I might lift my presser foot to make sure that this is smooth. So just take your time with this step. As you come back around to the beginning of your stitching, you're going to open this piece of bias tape up and just fold it back right to where the stitching started. So you can see that stitch and make sure it's folded straight back. You don't want it going at an angle. And then you're going to lay this other piece of bias tape right over top, and you want to stitch right up to the edge of this fold, meeting that stitching that you started with. So the way that I like to do that is to just use a pin and kind of stick it in where I think the stitching is, and then lift up and check. You need to come just a little bit closer. So that's going pretty much right through the stitching. So I can see that little pin mark, and now I can just use a pen to mark that, or you could leave the pin in and just move it away as you get closer. And then stitch right up to that line, back stitching at the end. To join our two ends of bias tape, we're going to take the end, so this is where we started stitching, this is the end, and we're going to open this piece up. Normally I do try and fold this piece completely open, but because of the batting, it's almost impossible to do. So if you can work it open, go ahead, but it's okay if this is folded closed. So you're going to lay that one flat, and then we need to lay this piece right side together at a 90-degree angle to that piece. So we're going to fold our pot holder in half, which will allow us to get this piece sitting right over top of our bias tape. So we have right sides together, and that's nice and flat. There aren't any creases in it. And just use a couple pins to hold that in place. And now we're going to stitch a line diagonally going from where this edge and this edge intersect. So right there, and we're going to stitch diagonally right across to where our stitching is there. Okay, before you cut these tails off, you just want to open that up and make sure that you're happy with that seam and there isn't any bubbling and it's going to sit nice and flat. And if that looks good, then you can just trim this following the stitching line and getting rid of this bulk. Before we flip our bias tape over, we're going to trim down some of our seam allowance just to get rid of some of the bulk and make it easier to get that bias tape folded over to the other side and covering this line of stitching. You want to make sure that you're cutting an equal distance away from this stitching so that your bias tape, when it folds over, it's going to be hugging these edges. So if you're inconsistent and you cut off more here than over here, or your line is crooked, your bias tape will reflect that. Flip your bias tape over to the other side. Before I clip the second side of the bias tape into place, I like to use the tip of my iron and just press along the edges, which will help flatten the batting and make it a bit easier to clip down, and also make sure that this fabric is laying a bit flatter so it doesn't get accidentally creased or folded up as I'm pinning. Now I'll clip it into place, making sure that this folded edge is covering this line of stitching. Before I stitch this into place, I do go over the bias tape one more time with the iron. I just find that it helps make that crease a little crisper, and it helps these corners form into place just to make sure that it stays in place while I'm stitching. So you can see here how the fabric is a little bit bubbled on the corner. Once I run my iron over it, kind of relaxes the fibers and it sits in place nicely. So you can see how that follows the curve a little nicer. So this is the side of the bias tape that we need to stitch down, but I sew from this side about 1/8 of an inch inside from this folded edge, and I'll just go really slow and check as I'm going to make sure that this folded edge is staying over the line of stitching. And there's your finished pot holder.